Well, while much of the research in the growing China-Africa field focuses on state-level bilateral and multilateral relations, there have been fewer studies focused on civil society and public perceptions of recent and increasing contact with China and Chinese migrants. Joining us now to discuss China-Africa relations are Professor Sam ZHAO from the University of Denver in the US and Barry Sautmann from Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. A very warm welcome to you, professors. Well, one of the things I was saying to you is perhaps the topic of our discussion today is really Chinese presence on the African continent, whether it be companies or migrants. From what you've been hearing and perhaps from your own experience in research, what is the general sense that you get from Africans and how they feel about Chinese presence on the African continent? I suppose I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, there have been surveys taken among Africans about their perceptions of China and Chinese. Some of these surveys have been done by polling companies such as Gallup or Pew in the United States. Afrobarometer is another major poll that's taken periodically of African opinion about various political and economic matters, and it includes questions about China and Chinese. BBC has also done some polling. And what these polls show is that, by and large, Africans have a positive view of both China and Chinese, including the Chinese presence in Africa. Of course, that doesn't mean that they have no negative comments to make, but it's surprisingly positive given what one typically hears about African reactions to China and Chinese.
Professor ZHAO, I want to ask you, though, what are some of the negative perceptions that people have?
For the Chinese side, for the African side, to perceive China on the negative side, there are a lot of behavior from the Chinese side. For example, Chinese companies doing business, their practice are not very transparent. And also sometimes there's some corruption involved. And also Chinese companies, basically Chinese immigrants, they try to live isolated of the local society and also do not learn the local culture and language. So in other words, they are not immersed into the local society. So those are some of those negative images of Chinese.
And one of the things that I was finding is that this is sometimes a source of conflict, this cultural and social differences between the migrants, the Chinese migrants that might come to some of the African countries.
Yeah, the cultures are very different. African society is very different from Chinese culture, and also the Chinese immigrants here, they don't understand the language here, English language, and they don't know the rules and laws and the games, the how to conduct business in this society. So very often they sometimes treated local people in their own way. Involved, for example, when they do some projects, they did not have high quality. They thought in the Chinese society they can use money, just envelopes to buy local officials and get things done. So in that case, there are a lot of negative consequences.
Professor Sautmann, I want to ask you though, because sometimes you'll find that the complaint that you'll find sometimes with local businesses in African countries, they'll say that we're getting all these goods that are coming from China. We can compete. They're much, much cheaper than what we're offering, and that becomes a point of contention.
It does among people who have a direct interest, of course, in trading. But one also has to look at the other side, which is the benefits to consumers. That is to say that as Chinese goods enter a country, a lot of people who previously couldn't afford to buy anything new can afford to buy those Chinese goods. And in fact, there was a very important study done by a professor at the University of Johannesburg, an economist, who showed that in South Africa, the influx of Chinese goods did result in some people being laid off in sectors like textiles and clothing. But on the other hand, the retail sector expanded dramatically, so that a lot of South Africans who were buying new goods for the first time were producing an expansion of the retail sector, and those retail businesses were taking on new employees.
I want to talk a little bit about the labor relations, because there has been a perception globally about labor relations in China, and how sometimes when those companies, when Chinese companies go into other countries, that the labor relations are not what they should be. Your experience and what you're hearing.
Well, labor relations vary a great deal according to the sector that's involved. there are more acute labor relations problems, for example, in the construction sector than in some other sectors. And in part, that's because of the very low margins at which companies in that sector operate. In the mining sector, they have a higher margin, so that the degree of labor strife is perhaps reduced as a result of that. In those sectors where the businesses are operating really at the margin, then pay is quite low. And there's a lot of discontent in terms of the level of pay. But that's, of course, true not just with Chinese businesses, but of businesses generally within that sector.
And we have seen that a lot, particularly here in South Africa. Professor ZHAO, I want to come to you. One of the things we talk about a lot is Chinese presence on the African continent, but we don't talk so much about African presence in China. I would like you to talk a little bit about that.
And the Africans now have come to China, mostly in southern China, in terms of doing business in Guangzhou, for example. I was in Guangzhou some time ago and saw a lot of Africans. In fact, they have lived also together, like the Chinese in Africa tend to live in isolation of the Chinese society, but they try to get involved in the Chinese society. But just like the situation in this continent, culturally they are also very different from Chinese society. And also there is some perception in the among Chinese people, kind of racially discriminated against Africans in China. There was an incident, I think last month or 2 months ago, African business person in Guangzhou got into a conflict with a taxi driver. Then he was badly treated, and afterwards there was somehow unrest among the African immigrant society, and the Chinese government responded in that incident. I thought was very well, tried to resolve that issue from a legal perspective and treated the people who hated African person as a criminal. So African presence in Chinese society, just like Chinese presence in the African society, also caused some kind of conflicts.
How important is it, the way the government responds when these conflicts arise, when these perceptions, you know, of whatever perceptions it can be, particularly the negative ones? How important is it in the way the government responds in dealing with that?
Government should be in a position, take a neutral position, try to follow legal procedure, and also try to provide an environment which is fair and transparent to the people from inside Chinese society and also from other societies. But I think Chinese society has a very racial kind of bias against Africans. They treat Westerners one way and Africans another way. So the government should be in a position to try to follow rules and also educate Chinese people about the visitors from both Western societies and African societies.
One of the things that we've talked about on the program is, for instance, businesses, when we talk about investment, about Chinese investment on the African continent, there has been this perception that when that investment comes in, it's almost as though some of the African countries are not saying, well, this is the criteria with which you can invest into our countries, and that at some level that you'll find that the Chinese money that's coming in is calling the shots. Is that something that you've heard happening? How do we manage that? How do we deal with it?
I think it's dealt with by African countries thinking about the problem and offering their own solutions to it. If you look around Africa, different African governments have different policies with regard to how they treat foreign capital. For example, with regard to the retail sector, in Ethiopia, it's impossible for a Chinese business person to establish a retail outlet. They can do wholesaling, but the law prohibits them from entering into retailing. But in Zambia, it's wide open, and the government allows people, regardless of their nationality, to come in and do retailing. So governments have to decide what's the best policy for them. And I think in general, most African governments have decided that certain sectors should be reserved for people of their own nationality.
Thank you so much for joining us, Professor.